Section 21 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 6, Part 2. Elisabeth's great dread, in the perilous year for Protestantism, 1569, was a Catholic coalition throughout Europe in behalf of her royal prisoner, Mary Queen of Scots. Ireland was in a state of revolt, the northern counties progressing to the same. The Protestant cause had received two severe blows, the retreat of the Prince of Orange, and the victory of the Duke of Anjou at Jarnac. Jealousy between the courts of France and Spain had proved her safeguard hitherto, but there was a prospect of a new bond of union in the proposed marriages of Charles IX and Philip II with the daughters of the Emperor Maximilian. Elisabeth thought it possible to prevent this brotherly alliance by a little coquetry, on her own account, with Charles IX. Her hand had been twice solicited by the plenipotentiaries of that prince, and she had declined because of his tender youth. His Majesty was now really marriageable, though much too young to be a suitable consort for her, yet she might, without committing herself too deeply, contrive to lure him from his imperial fiancé. Catherine de Medici's favourite project was to marry her second son, the Duke of Anjou, to Elisabeth, and that able intriguer, La Mothe Fenelon, had instructions to bring this matter to pass if possible. With this design constantly in view, the conversations between him and her Majesty of England invariably turned to the subject of matrimony. The conference in which Elisabeth threw out her first lure for the young King of France, as related by La Mothe, has almost dramatic interest. The Queen began by asking news of the marriages between Charles IX and Philip of Spain with the daughters of the Emperor, which appeared to give her uneasiness. La Mothe fully exemplified Sir William Wotton's character of an ambassador, whom he defined to be a person sent to lie abroad for the service of his country, for he denied any knowledge of his master's intended marriage. Elisabeth told him that she had heard for certain that the marriages were concluded, and repeated the eulogiums she had heard of the fine stature and martial appearance of Charles and his brother, and of their vigorous constitutions and excellent dispositions. How Charles IX, in martial bearing and skill in horsemanship, resembled Henry II his father, who was the most accomplished warrior of any prince in his times, and that his brother had exchanged all his boyish diversions at court for heroic and difficult enterprises, and that everybody wonderfully commended him. She concluded this flourish by observing, that as the Princess of Portugal had been proposed as a match first to the king and afterwards to Anjou, she herself could not be considered as too old. I told her, said La Mothe Fenelon, that all the world stood amazed at the wrong she did to the grand endowments that God had given her of beauty, wisdom, virtue, and exalted station, by refusing to leave fair posterity to succeed her. It was a duty she owed to God, who had given her power of choice, to elect some partner, and that she could not find a prince more worthy of such distinction than one of the three sons of the late King of France, Henry II. The eldest of them was the true successor of his father, the second, royal in all conditions excepting being crowned, and the third would, without doubt, in time be equal to his brethren. This last was the young Alençon, to whom Elisabeth was almost married when she was many years older. But the point to which all this expert flattery tended was to persuade her to wed the handsome Duke of Anjou. Elisabeth pretended to discuss the possibility of wedding the elder of these much lauded princes, and, for the purpose of eliciting a stronger dose of flattery from the ambassador, replied, that the king, Charles IX, would none of her, for he would be ashamed to show, at an entry into Paris, a queen for his wife so old as she was, and that she was not of an age to leave her country, like the Queen of Scots, who was taken young to France. The ambassador replied, if such a marriage could happen, then would commence the most illustrious lineage that had been known for the last 1,000 years, but that previously she had been objecting to the age of his king, and now she was finding fault with her own. Meantime, she had so well spent her years, that time had carried away none of her beauties. while King Charles and the Duke of Anjou had so well profited by time, that they had acquired beauty, strength, and stature, so that no men could be more perfect. The king certainly ought to desire the Queen of England to make her entry into Paris as his wife, for it was there she would be the most honoured, most welcome, and most blessed by all the good people and nobility of France, and if she suffered with passing the sea, nevertheless she would find it a most happy voyage, from which she would ultimately receive great pleasure and satisfaction. At the time of uttering this flourish, the ambassador was as well convinced as the queen herself that Charles IX was almost married to Elisabeth, the youngest daughter of the emperor. "I know not," rejoined Elisabeth, "if the queen, Catharine de Medicis, would approve of it, for it is possible she might choose to have a daughter-in-law whom she might mould to her pleasure." "I know," answered the ambassador, "that the queen mother is so benign, and of such humane and gracious conversation, that nothing in the world would be more agreeable than for you to be together. Witness the honour and respect in which she has always held the Queen of Scotland, and that she now bears to her." When this interview was over, Cecil came to discuss with him the projected marriage of the King of Spain with the eldest daughter of the emperor. "I was far enough from giving him a hint respecting the marriage of the youngest," added the ambassador, "but declared I would treat with him touching another marriage, which would be the most apropos in the world for the aggrandizement of the two realms, and for the universal peace of Christianity." A future day was then appointed for Queen Elizabeth to receive another repast of these frothy compliments. The French ambassador subjoined to his dispatches a dissertation on the queen's real intentions regarding marriage, and it is certain the result bore out his view of the subject. "It is the general opinion," he wrote, "that Queen Elizabeth will never marry, but when her subjects press her to name her successor, she meets the inconvenient proposal by a feigned intention of entering into some marriage she never means to conclude." And he brought, as an instance, the late feudal negotiation regarding the Archduke Charles. The Earl of Arundel, who had been for many years a suitor for the hand of Queen Elizabeth, made no scruple of declaring that the intimacy between her and the Earl of Leicester was the reason for her refusing all her suitors, whether they were foreign princes or English peers. This great noble, according to the report of the French ambassador, instigated his son-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk, to call Leicester to a sharp account for familiarities with the queen, which they affirmed disgraced them all, as Englishmen, as well as the crown she wore, and that neither the English nobility, nor her subjects in general, would permit the continuance of such proceedings. They then taxed Leicester with using his privilege of entrée into the queen's bedchamber unbecomingly, affirming that he went there before she rose, and that he took upon himself the office of her lady-in-waiting, by handing to her a garment which ought never to have been seen in the hands of her master of horse. Moreover, they charged him with kissing her majesty when he was not invited thereto. It is very evident that the first queens regnant of England had many officers in attendance in their private apartments, the same as if they had been kings, and in this instance the fault found was, not that Leicester had the right of entrée into the royal sleeping apartment, but that he used it at improper times, and took freedoms which the Premier Duke and the Premier Earl of England deemed derogatory to the decorum which ought to be observed towards the female sovereign of their country. They proceeded to exhort Leicester to be candid and say if the queen really wished to marry him, and then they would both unite their influence with the nobility and the rest of the nation to sanction their honourable union and stop all this scandal. Leicester, the arrogant Leicester, seems to have assumed the humble tone of a chided inferior to these two great peers. He thanked them both for their offer and for their warning. He acknowledged that the queen had shown him such good affection as had emboldened him to use some well-intentioned familiarities in the hope of espousing her. He assured the Duke of Norfolk that he had by this offer of assistance laid him under the greatest obligation in the world, and at the same time had done his duty well to the queen and the crown, as a faithful vassal and counsellor ought, and during the remainder of his life he would never forget the same. Neither, according to Bishop Goodman, did he ever forget that Norfolk had once bestowed on him a box on the ear. Till Norfolk subsequently laid his head on the block, there is little doubt this conversation was duly remembered by Leicester, as well as the unlucky box on the ear. He assuredly understood the intentions of Norfolk and Arundel as well as they did themselves. Arundel had long wooed Queen Elizabeth. Norfolk, who had previously married his heiress, was the father of a son who was, at the same time, heir of Arundel, and a mutual bond between them. Norfolk was a widower and the secret suitor of Mary Queen of Scots. Thus a strong family compact already existed between these noblemen, the two greatest of the ancient English aristocracy, and if the earl wedded Queen Elizabeth, the actual possessor of the English crown, and the duke, the Queen of Scotland, and heiress of the whole island, they might well deem that their united strength might have defied the sons of little men, whom the Tudor monarchs had called from the shears and the forge, to guide the civil and religious government of England. As for Leicester's freedoms in the chamber of the Queen, there is no reason for implicit belief that they ever occurred, merely because we find them in a French ambassador's dispatch. But that such were the current reports at the English court is indubitable, and when the intentions of Norfolk and his father-in-law, Arundel, in regard to the marriages they projected with Queen Elizabeth and her captive heiress, are considered, the fact that they held their conversation with the favourite and taxed him with the scandal circulating at court becomes highly probable, and is in consonance with other facts which are narrated by eyewitnesses, both as to her past and future conduct. It was the policy of the two great nobles, Norfolk and Arundel, to clear their path of the favourite, as the matrimonial pretender to the hand of Elizabeth, and, according to La Mothe's letter, this measure was speedily effected. Some days after, he resumes, the said lady, meaning Queen Elizabeth, being earnestly pressed to declare her intentions respecting the Earl of Leicester, resolutely answered, that she pretended not to marriage with him. Since this reply, both have conducted themselves more modestly, and he has withdrawn the expensive parade he made while he had hopes of success in his enterprise. Perhaps Elizabeth was far more incensed at this forced éclaircissement of her intentions than Leicester. Although she did not intend to bring their courtship to the serious termination of matrimony, she evidently liked Leicester to flutter about her as a declared pretender to her hand. On the contrary, he wished to be at liberty to marry, which he afterwards did, and was withal suffering cruelly in his property, from the gorgeous display he was expected to keep up at court, while he sustained the character of the queen's suitor, whom her realm expected, hourly, she would declare to be her spouse. There are very evident indications that for some time subsequent to this crisis, occasional agitating scenes passed between the queen and Leicester, while the endless negotiations for her marriage with Anjou were proceeding. Leicester, in one of his letters to Walsingham, then ambassador at Paris, declares his queen was in good health, save some spice, or show, of hysteric fits. These fits do not trouble her more than a quarter of an hour, yet this little in her hath bred strange bruits, or gossip, here at home. God send her, I beseech him, a long life. The treachery of Leicester's conduct with regard to the Duke of Norfolk and the other noblemen he had been the means of drawing into the snare he had planned for their destruction, by his pretended desire of the marriage of Norfolk to the Queen of Scots, appears a dark picture of the principles of Elizabeth's cabinet. Leicester had a twofold object in view: the destruction of his great enemy, Sussex, as well as that of Norfolk. Sussex, who was related in the same degree by his mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, to Norfolk and to the Queen, had undoubtedly favoured the idea of a marriage between Norfolk and the Queen of Scots. But when he found the dangerous tendency of some of the ramifications of the plot, he recoiled from it, as inconsistent with his duty to his sovereign. Elizabeth was at first incensed against him, But though not honest herself either in word or deed, she knew how to estimate those who were, and finally confided to her plain-speaking kinsman the command of the forces appointed to quell the northern insurgents. Leicester had encouraged the duke to hope for the accomplishment of his wishes by undertaking to obtain the queen's consent, but put off from day to day mentioning the matter. Cecil observed the perplexity of the duke, advised him to seek her majesty, and revealed to her the matter he had on his mind, whatever it might be. If Norfolk could have resolved to do this, it would probably have saved his life, but instead of acting without delay on this judicious advice, he sought counsel of Leicester, who dissuaded him from that course, and promised to name it to her majesty the next time she went to walk in the fields. Norfolk himself records that when the court was at Guildford, he came unaware into the queen's privy chamber, and found her majesty sitting on the threshold of the door, listening with one ear to a little child, who was singing and playing on the lute to her, and with the other to Leicester, who was kneeling by her side. The duke, a little confused, no doubt at interrupting a party so conveniently arranged, drew back, but her majesty bade him enter. Soon after Leicester rose and came to Norfolk, leaving the queen listening to the child, and told him that he was dealing with the queen in his behalf when he approached. To which the simple peer responded, "If I had known so much, I would not have come up," and eagerly inquired how he found her majesty disposed. Leicester replied, "Indifferently well," adding, that the queen had promised to speak to him herself at Thornham, at my lord of Arundel's. "Before her highness came to Thornham," says Norfolk, "she commanded me to sit down, most unworthy, at her highness's board, where at the end of dinner her majesty gave me a nip, saying, that she would wish me to take good heed to my pillow." Like many of Elisabeth's bon mots, this sharp innuendo cut two ways, conveying as it did a threat of the block, and a sarcastic allusion to the unworthy expression he had condescended to use, when endeavouring to persuade her that he had no intention of becoming the husband of the Scottish queen. Then followed the contemptible farce of Leicester's feigned sickness at Titchfield, and his message to the queen that he could not die in peace without confessing his faults, and obtaining her pardon for his guilt. Elisabeth hastened to his bedside, and he acknowledged with many sighs and tears how deeply he had sinned against her, by being privy to a design of marrying her foe, the Queen of Scots, to the Duke of Norfolk, and under pretence of making a clear conscience, put her into possession of the whole of the circumstances of the plot, in which many of the principal nobles of the realm were implicated. There was no proof, however, that any attempt against either the life or government of Elisabeth was contemplated. It was simply a plan for the restoration of Mary to liberty and royal dignity, by becoming the wife of the great Protestant English peer, whom her own rebels of the Reformed faith had first solicited to unite himself with her. The treacherous Leicester probably led Elisabeth to suppose that much more was intended. The next time her majesty saw the duke, she called him to her in the gallery, and sharply reprimanded him for presuming to attempt a match with the Queen of Scots without her cognizance, and commanded him on his allegiance to give over these pretensions. The duke promised to do so, and proudly added, that his estate in England was worth little less than the whole realm of Scotland, in the ill state to which the wars had reduced it, and that when he was in his own tennis court at Norwich, he thought himself as great as a king. The next day the queen refused the suit of the Spanish ambassador for the liberation of the royal prisoner, observing at the same time, that she would advise the Queen of Scots to bear her condition with less impatience, or she might chance to find some of those on whom she relied shorter by the head. Norfolk now found his situation at court intolerable. The queen regarded him with looks of anger and disdain, and Leicester and all his former associates treated him with studied insolence. He endeavoured to avoid collision with those who sought to force a quarrel, by returning with his father-in-law, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Pembroke, first to London, and afterwards to his princely seat at Kenninghall in Norfolk, whence he wrote an apologetic letter to the queen, attributing his departure To the pain he felt at her displeasure, and his mortification at the treatment to which he had been subjected by the insolence of his foes, by whom he had been made a common table talk, the queen sent a peremptory order for his return to court, which the duke obeyed, and was arrested by her order at Burnham, 3 miles from Windsor, and committed to the Tower. He was subjected to an examination by Lord Keeper Bacon, Northampton, Sadler, Bedford, and Cecil, but they reported to her majesty that the duke had not put himself under the penalty of the law by any overt act of treason, and that it would be difficult to convict him without this. "Away," she replied, "what the law fails to do, my authority shall effect." Her rage was so ungovernable that she fell into a fit, and they were forced to apply vinegar and other stimulants to revive her. The Queen of Scots naturally felt the ill effects of the treachery of her supposed friend, Leicester. His denouncements placed her, as well as her friends, in a most perilous position, and the Earl of Huntingdon, Leicester's brother-in-law, the immediate descendant of George, Duke of Clarence, and, like all that line, a covert pretender to the regal succession, was associated with the Earl of Shrewsbury, in the ungracious office of gaoler to the royal captive. Mary's terror at this appointment is described in a lively manner in the letters written by her at this period, and also her distress of mind at the peril to which Norfolk was exposed for her sake, but the details belong to her life and not to that of Elizabeth, who must perforce occupy the foreground of her own history. The arrest of Norfolk precipitated the disastrous rising in the north, under the luckless earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland. The re-establishment of Catholicism in England was the object of this insurrection, and it may be regarded as a second part to that ebullition of misdirected zeal and patriotism, the Pilgrimage of Grace, 36 years before, and it is a curious fact, that the persons engaged in the Northern Rebellion were the sons of those who figured as pilgrims. Wordsworth, in a few of his graceful lines, appears to have given a very clear and correct view of the case. No apology can be required for quoting them, pleasingly illustrative as they are of the period in question. It was the time when England's queen 12 years had reigned a sovereign dread, nor yet the restless crown had been disturbed upon her virgin head. But now the inly working north was ripe to send its thousands forth, a potent vassalage to fight, in Percy's and in Neville's right, 2 earls fast leagued in discontent, who gave their wishes open vent, and boldly urged the general plea, the rights of ancient piety, to be triumphantly restored by the dread justice of the sword. Mary Stuart, as the Catholic heiress of the crown, and exciting by her beauty and misfortunes, her persecutions and her patience, the deepest interest among the chivalry of the north, who were chiefly professors of the same creed, was the watchword and leading point of the association. Whether the plot was fomented by her is doubtful. It has, however, been generally supposed, that Shakespeare's mysterious lines in the Midsummer Night's Dream imply that some seductions had been used by the captive queen to charm the northern magnates from their duty to their own sovereign. Once I sat upon a promontory, and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath, that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music. The rebel earls entered Durham in warlike array, November 14th. Richard Norton, of Norton Conyers, who had married the sister of Queen Catharine Parr's second husband, Neville Lord Latimer, a hoary-headed gentleman, aged 71, bore the banner of the cross before the insurgents. The Nortons ancient had the cross, and the 5 wounds our Lord did bear. The principal exploits of the misguided multitude who followed this banner consisted in burning the translations of the Scriptures and the liturgies in all the towns they passed through. They had neither plan, order, nor money to maintain themselves in the rash positions they had assumed. A few days sufficed the Earl of Sussex to crush the insurrection. The 2 earls fled, Northumberland to Scotland, where, falling into the hands of Murray, he was sold to the English government and brought to the block, Westmoreland took refuge in Flanders and died in exile. The calamity of the Percys, Nortons, Dacres, and Nevilles, and other noble ancient families, who took part in this disastrous rising, inspired some of the noblest historical ballads and metrical romances in our language. Elizabeth herself became malignly poetical on the occasion, and perpetrated the following sonnet, as it is styled. The doubt of future foes exiles my present joy, and wit me warns to shun such snares as threaten mine annoy. For falsehood now doth flow, and subjects' faith doth ebb, which would not be if reason ruled, or wisdom wove the web. But clouds of toys untried do cloak aspiring minds, which turned to rain of late repent, by course of changed winds. The top of hope supposed, the root of ruth will be, and fruitless all their grafted guiles, as ye shall shortly see. These dazzled eyes with pride, which great ambition blinds, shall be unsealed by worthy wights, whose foresight falsehood binds. The daughter of debate, that eke discord doth sow, shall reap no gain, where former rule hath taught still peace to grow. No foreign banished wight shall anchor in this port. Our realm it brooks no stranger's force, let them elsewhere resort. Our rusty sword with rest shall first his edge employ, to pull their tops that seek such change, and gape for joy. Elizabeth made good the threats with which this unfeminine effusion concludes, for besides the execution of the leaders of the rebellion as fell into her hands, she compelled her victorious general, Sussex, to deluge the northern counties with the blood of the simple, unreflective peasants, who had been induced to join the revolt. The learned research of Sir Cuthbert Sharp has brought to light some hideous facts in contemporary documents preserved among the Bowes manuscripts. Staunch, indeed, must be the admirers of good Queen Bess, who can calmly peruse the following order for the hangings in Richmondshire without a shudder. The Earl of Sussex to Sir George Bowes. Sir George Bowes, I have set the numbers to be executed down in every town, as I did in your other book, which draweth near to 200, wherein you may use your discretion in taking more or less in every town, as you shall see just cause for the offences and fitness for example, so as, in the whole, you pass not of all kind of such the number of 200, amongst whom you may not execute any that hath freeholds, or noted wealthy, for so is the Queen's Majesty's pleasure. By her special commandment, 10th of January, 1569-70. T. Sussex. Under the list of those who joined from each town and village, the Earl of Sussex has written the number to be executed, amounting to every 5th man. The fearful order was tardily executed, and Sussex wrote to spur on the reluctant ministers of the royal vengeance. In his letter of the 19th of January, addressed to Sir George Bowes, he says, I received, yesternight, letters from the court, whereby I perceive that the Queen's Majesty doth much marvel that she doth not hear from me that the execution is yet ended, and that she is disburdened of her charges that was considered for that respect, and therefore I heartily pray you to use expedition, for I fear this lingering will breed displeasure to us both. The richer sort purchased their lives, but no less than 800 of the working classes perished by the hands of the executioner. Leicester had expressed a great wish to march against the rebels, but the Queen detained him as her principal adviser and protector in case of danger. Early in the spring of 1570, Pope Pius V published his bull of excommunication against Queen Elizabeth, and on the morning of May 15th, a copy of this anathema against the sovereign was found fixed on the gates of the Bishop of London's palace in St. Paul's. After strict search, a duplicate was discovered in the possession of a student of Lincoln's Inn, who, being put to the torture, confessed that he received it from Mr. Felton, a rich Catholic gentleman of Southwark. Felton, on being apprehended, not only acknowledged that he had set up the bull on the Bishop of London's gate, but gloried in the daring act, bore the rack without betraying his accomplices, and went to the scaffold in the spirit of a martyr. As the purport of the bull was to deprive Elizabeth of the title of queen and the allegiance of her subjects, Felton gave her no other title than the Pretender, but, at his execution, he said, he begged her pardon if he had injured her; and drawing a magnificent diamond ring, value £400, from his finger, requested the Earl of Sussex, who was present, to give it to her in his name, as a token that he died in peace with her, bearing her no malice for his sufferings and death. The bull caused little mischief, but great annoyance to Elizabeth. She even condescended to solicit the Emperor Maximilian to procure its revocation. A sarcastic query from the pontiff, in reply to the imperial intervention, was the only result of this undignified proceeding on the part of the head of the Protestant Church. In August, the plague broke out in London, and some deaths having occurred in the Tower, Elizabeth was induced to release the Duke of Norfolk, on his promising to give up all future correspondence with the Queen of Scots, and attempts in her behalf. He was then allowed to return to his own mansion at the Charterhouse, where he remained for a time as a prisoner at large, under the charge of his friend, Sir Henry Neville. A sort of riot had taken place in his behalf among his loving tenantry and servants at Harleston Fair, in his territorial county of Norfolk. Some of the nobles and gentry in that neighbourhood were supposed to have encouraged the outbreak, but it was merely regarded as the effects of pot vapour on the part of the men of Harleston, and no injury resulted to the duke for their injudicious way of manifesting their affection. On the assassination of the Scottish regent, Murray, Elizabeth was urged by the friends of the captive Queen of Scots, both in France and Scotland, to reinstate her to her royal authority under certain conditions, which might have been rendered of great political advantage to England, but those demanded by Elizabeth were neither in Mary's power, nor consistent with her honour to perform, especially as the sine qua non was, that she should give up her infant son, who had been crowned King of Scotland, as her principal hostage. The possession of this princely babe had been the great object of Elizabeth's intrigues, almost from the time of his birth, but neither Mary nor the lords of the congregation would hear of trusting him to her keeping. The times, says Camden, were then full of suspicions and conspiracies. For Thomas and Edward Stanley, the two younger sons of the Earl of Derby, by the Duke of Norfolk's daughter, with Sir Thomas Gerald, Ralston, Hall, and others of the county of Derby, conspired to free the Queen of Scots out of prison, but Ralston's son betrayed the confederacy, and the parties were arrested, except Hall, who fled to Scotland, where he was afterwards taken, at the fall of Dumbarton Castle, and put to death in London. Mary's ambassador, the Bishop of Ross, being implicated in this plot, was once more sent to the Tower. Elizabeth had taken a terrible vengeance on the border counties of Scotland, for the encouragement of the partisans of the Queen of Scots, there had given to the rebels in the north of England, for she caused Sussex, with a military force, to burn and lay waste nearly 300 villages. These cruelties were regarded as so many triumphs by those who heard the progress made by the unresisted bands of England, and saw not the misery caused by the inglorious work of destruction that was perpetrated. Section 21.